The dismembered body of a man police believed to be in his 20s was found in garbage bags behind an apartment on the north side of Chicago, just a few doors away from where Larry Eyler lives. Neighbors in the area say they saw Eyler recently carrying bags to the dumpster. Chicago police tell me they are still in the process of searching the area for evidence, and they are questioning Eyler in connection with this murder.
Before he became known as the Highway Killer, Larry Eyler was just a boy growing up in a family that was constantly breaking apart. He was born on December 21, 1952, in Crawfordsville, Indiana, the youngest of 4 children. His father, George, struggled with alcoholism and was known to be physically and emotionally abusive toward both his wife and the children. Home was not a safe place. Arguments, shouting, and sudden outbursts were a normal part of Larry's early memories, long before he was old enough to understand what any of it meant. When Larry was only a few years old, his parents divorced. It was the mid-1950s, and in a small Midwestern town, a broken home was something people noticed. His mother, Shirley, suddenly had 4 children to raise almost entirely on her own. To keep the family afloat, she worked long hours, weekdays split between a factory and a waitressing job, sometimes picking up shifts in a bar on weekends. With no money and no partner she could rely on, she often had no choice but to leave the 2 youngest, Larry and his sister, in the care of babysitters, foster families, or their older siblings, who themselves were still children. Those separations left a mark on him. Years later, Larry would say that the constant leaving and returning made the family closer, but for a small child, it also meant learning early that the people you depend on can disappear for long stretches of time. That tension between wanting to feel protected and constantly being reminded that protection could vanish would follow him throughout his life. In 1957, his mother remarried. The new stepfather drank heavily, just like Larry's biological father. The marriage lasted barely a year. There would be more. She married again in 1960, and once more the relationship collapsed after a few years. In 1972, she married for the 4th time. Across those years, the pattern was always the same. Another man in the house, more drinking, more instability, and more abuse. At least one of Larry's stepfathers regularly punished him by forcing his head under scalding hot water, a method of discipline that was both physically painful and deeply humiliating. School didn't offer much of an escape. Larry attended St. Joseph's School in Lebanon, Indiana. He was tall for his age and active in sports, but that didn't protect him from being singled out. Other kids mocked him for being poor, for coming from a broken home, for being different in ways they couldn't quite define. His older sister, Teresa, often stepped in to defend him, confronting bullies when teachers didn't. To the staff, Larry appeared quiet, polite, and generally likable, but he had very few close friends and spent most of his time on the margins. At home, the instability and abuse continued. As he grew older, Larry's behavior became more stubborn and unpredictable. He acted out, pushed back against authority, and struggled to control his anger. In 1963, when he was still only a boy, his mother made a decision she hoped would straighten him out. She placed him in a home for unruly boys. For Larry, it felt less like discipline and more like abandonment. The separation devastated him. Within weeks, he begged his mother in tears to bring him back home. Psychological testing followed. The results showed that Larry was of average intelligence, but emotionally fragile. He was described as severely insecure, with a deep fear of separation and abandonment, a fear that made perfect sense given his early life. Staff who evaluated him believed the root of his problems lay not in some inborn defect, but in the chaos and trauma of his home environment. They recommended that he be placed temporarily in a Catholic boys' home in Fort Wayne, away from the constant instability that had defined his childhood. He stayed there for about 6 months before returning once again to his mother's care. As he entered adolescence, another internal conflict appeared, one he couldn't discuss openly with teachers or classmates. Around puberty, Larry realized he was attracted to men. In the conservative Midwest of the 1960s, being gay was something rarely spoken of and almost never accepted. He did eventually come out to his family, but acceptance didn't erase the shame he felt. He struggled with intense self-hatred about his sexuality, especially because he had been somewhat religious as a child. To a few trusted people, he admitted that he couldn't reconcile what he'd been taught about right and wrong with what he felt inside. On the surface, he tried to live like everyone expected him to. In high school, he occasionally dated girls, but the relationship stayed superficial and never became physical. He didn't belong with the popular kids, but he wasn't a complete outcast either, just someone who never quite fit. Teachers saw a student who was capable but unfocused. His attitude toward school was indifferent, almost careless. He skipped classes, didn't apply himself, and drifted further away from any real plan for the future. Eventually, he failed to graduate with his class. Instead of finishing high school the traditional way, he later earned a GED. It was a small attempt to repair what he had broken academically, but it didn't solve the larger problem. He still had no clear direction in life, no solid identity, and no stable support system. In his late teens and early 20s, Larry floated from job to job. For a time, he worked as a private security guard at Marion County General Hospital, a role that gave him a uniform and a small sense of authority. He lasted about 6 months before losing that position and moving on to a job in a shoe store. None of these jobs turned into a career. They were placeholders, temporary structures in a life that never really settled. During this period, he began spending more time in Indianapolis, gradually finding his way into the city's gay community. Bars, clubs, and late-night hangouts gave him, for the first time, spaces where he didn't have to pretend to be straight. But even there, the conflict inside him didn't disappear. People who knew him in those years later described two different sides of Larry Eyler. On one hand, a quiet, sometimes charming young man who could be friendly and easygoing. On the other, someone carrying a simmering anger and deep confusion about who he was and where he belonged. By the mid-1970s, these unresolved tensions, the childhood abuse, the constant instability, the fear of abandonment, the shame around his sexuality, had hardened into a personality that looked calm on the outside, but was far less stable beneath the surface. It was in this state, still relatively young and already shaped by years of emotional damage, that Larry Eyler stepped into adulthood. Long before the murders, before the headlines and mugshots, his life had already become a mix of loneliness, secrecy, and anger. The patterns that formed in those early years wouldn't excuse what he did later, but they help explain how a boy from a small Indiana town could one day become the man the world would come to know as the highway killer.
And he had...
Sheriff Jim Jenkins remembers the case well. He and another deputy were called to Spring Hill and Canal Roads in response to a stabbing. Once there, they found a man in his underwear, bound at the wrists and ankles, a stab wound in his chest. Larry Eyler showed up at the scene moments later. Eyler explained that he and the man were playing out one of Eyler's sexual fantasies. Eyler was armed with a 10-inch Bowie knife during the encounter.
I believe his words were that he forgot he had a knife in his hand, and he pushed this boy, and when he pushed him, he stabbed him.
The man never pressed charges against Eyler. Jenkins says he was too embarrassed. But the incident made it into the pages of a biography on Eyler. Author Geraldine Kolarek describes the stabbing in her book Freed to Kill, the true story of Larry Eyler. Jenkins says he didn't believe the stabbing was an accident 16 years ago. He's still convinced today.
A reasonable person, logical person, would just not believe that you forgot you had a 10-inch bladed knife in your hand. I think his scene got out.
On August 3rd, 1978, Larry Eyler stopped for a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Craig Long on 7th Street in Terre Haute. At first, it seemed like a normal ride, but shortly after Long got into the truck, Eyler made a sexual advance toward him. Long tried to get out immediately, but Eyler blocked him, pressing a knife to his chest. Long insisted he had no money, but Eyler told him that wasn't what he was after. Eyler then drove off the main road toward an isolated field. Once there, he forced Long out of the truck, ordered him to strip, handcuffed his wrists, tied his ankles, and made him climb into the bed of the pickup. When Eyler began undressing himself, Long saw a chance and tried to run. Eyler chased him and during the struggle stabbed him once in the chest, a wound that pierced Long's lung. Long collapsed and pretended to be dead until Eyler returned to the truck. Wounded but alive, Long eventually managed to stumble to a nearby house where the residents called for help. A short time later, Eyler actually drove up to the same house while Long was being treated. He calmly handed a deputy the key to the handcuffs and claimed the stabbing had been an accident. He was arrested on the spot. When police searched his vehicle, they found a disturbing collection of weapons: a hunting knife, a butcher knife, tear gas, another pair of handcuffs, a metal-tipped whip, and even a sword. It was a warning shot, one that the system failed to hear. After the attack on Long, Eyler's violent impulses quieted for a time, at least on record. But the anger, instability, and conflict that had shaped him for years didn't fade. They grew. And as the early 1980s arrived, Eyler began drifting more, traveling across Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky for work, nightlife, and reasons he never explained. His first known murder came on October 3, 1982. 14-year-old Delvoyd Baker disappeared in Indianapolis. Days later, his body was found outside the city, bound, stabbed, and left in a remote field. At the time, investigators treated it as a standalone case, a tragedy without context. They had no reason yet to suspect the pattern that was forming. 3 weeks later, on October 23rd, 19-year-old Stephen Crockett was discovered near Lowell, Indiana. He had been stabbed repeatedly, overkill that suggested personal anger, not a calculated attack. But without leads or witnesses, the investigation stalled immediately. Then came Christmas. On December 25, 1982, 25-year-old John Johnson was found in a rural field near Belshaw, Indiana. 3 days later, on December 28th, two victims, John Roach, 21, and Stephen Agan, 23, were discovered in different counties. Both had vanished only days prior. Both were found in isolated rural areas. By the turn of the year, Eyler had killed at least 5 men, but no one connected the dots. In March 1983, the murders spread into Illinois and Kentucky. On March 4th, 27-year-old Edgar Underkoffler was found in Danville, Illinois. On March 22nd, 26-year-old Jay Reynolds was discovered outside Lexington, Kentucky. Both men had been restrained. Both had been stabbed with a level of precision that suggested this was no impulsive act. It was practiced. April brought 2 more victims, both found in Lake Forest, Illinois. Gustavo Herrera, 28, on April 8th, Irvin Gibson, 16, on April 15th. Within a week, 2 young men, unrelated, from different towns, had been killed in the same way. By May 1983, the pattern accelerated. On May 9th, 2 victims, Jimmy T. Roberts, 18, and Daniel McNeve, 21, were found in rural areas across different counties. At this point, Eyler's attacks had crossed 3 states, dozens of cities, and countless miles of highway. His victims were usually hitchhikers, runaways, or young men he met in bars and along the road, people whose disappearances rarely triggered immediate alarm. In the summer of 1983, fear began spreading quietly inside the Midwest gay community. Whispers circulated about a man offering rides to young men, someone whose behavior shifted from charming to threatening without warning. A local gay newspaper, The Works, issued a community alert and created a hotline. But no one had a name to attach to the rumors. No one knew who they were warning people about. Meanwhile, Eyler continued moving freely between Indiana and Illinois, often staying with friends or acquaintances, always blending in just enough to avoid suspicion. Throughout 1983, more bodies were discovered. June 10th, 24-year-old Eric Hansen in Vermilion County, Illinois. August 31st, 22-year-old Ralph Calise, found near Lake Forest. September 3rd, 21-year-old John Bicknell, discovered near Rensselaer, Indiana. September 30th, 22-year-old Richard Tom, near Clay County, Illinois. Each scene told the same story. Young men, restrained, stabbed suddenly and violently, left in rural areas along major highways. Eyler was refining his method. Travel. Approach. Offer a ride. Choose someone vulnerable. Strike in isolation. Disappear before dawn. By the fall of 1983, he had killed more than a dozen men. He had slipped past jurisdictional boundaries, the limitations of 1980s record-keeping, and the lack of communication among police departments in different states. And still, no one knew his name. Eyler believed he was untouchable, but he was about to make a mistake, one that would put him directly in the path of detectives who had been searching for answers across the Midwest. This was the silent build-up to the case that would eventually reveal Larry Eyler as one of the most prolific and violent serial killers in Midwest history. After the murder of Ralph Calise on August 31, 1983, Larry Eyler's life moved into its final and most chaotic phase. What followed was a rapid descent, one marked by escalating violence, mounting suspicion, and the tightening grip of law enforcement that he could no longer outrun. Shortly after Calise's body was found, Eyler moved in with his secret lover, John Dobrovolskis, who lived with his wife and children. The arrangement was strange, tense, and only added to the growing instability around Eyler. He seemed constantly on edge, drifting in and out of the house, leaving for long drives without explanation.
It began in June with a call to the hotline set up by the Special Task Force investigating the murders. Police say a caller told them that Larry Eyler was a violent man, capable of murder. Based on that tip, detectives did investigate Eyler and obtained a search warrant to confiscate Eyler's pickup truck and other evidence.
On October 6th, police searched Eyler's pickup truck. They found suspicious items, but nothing solid enough to hold him. The lack of evidence frustrated investigators. They were convinced he was responsible for the growing body count, but the pieces weren't connecting fast enough. More victims followed. On October 15th, a John Doe was found near Rensselaer, Indiana. 4 days later, on October 19th, hunters discovered 4 skeletons in Newton County. Among them, 22-year-old Michael Bauer and 19-year-old John Bartlett. The remains were found together, clothing partially removed, one body even decapitated. The scene marked one of the largest mass dumps in Eyler's entire series. By mid-October, news spread quietly within Eyler's family that he was now a major suspect in multiple murders. They were stunned. Eyler's mother and siblings had always known he struggled emotionally, but the idea that he might be a serial killer was almost impossible for them to process. Around the same time, Eyler was arrested and taken to Lake County Jail as investigators scrambled to build a stronger case. But without direct evidence tying him to a specific murder, the legal system struggled to hold him. On October 29th, a judge refused to reduce his bond, keeping him confined but not yet convicted. The investigation expanded. On November 1st, police raided the home of Robert Little, an Indiana State University professor and close friend of Eyler. Some investigators suspected Little might have assisted Eyler or influenced aspects of his crimes, but evidence remained circumstantial. December brought even more bodies. On December 5th, another unidentified male was discovered near Effingham, Illinois. 2 days later, on December 7th, 20-year-old Richard Wayne and another John Doe were found dead near Indianapolis. At this point, investigators unofficially linked Eyler to around 18 murders, though they still lacked the single piece of evidence that would finally bring him down. That break came in mid-December when police located Craig Townsend, the survivor Eyler had kidnapped and beaten in 1982. Townsend positively identified Eyler in a lineup, finally giving prosecutors a crucial witness who connected him to violent crimes predating the murders. With this confirmation, law enforcement began tailing Eyler constantly. Everywhere he drove, detectives followed. Every stop, every errand, every late-night trip, they were there.
Larry Eyler, that Terre Haute man called by some police a suspect in a string of homosexual murders, is making another court move against police. He's already filed this civil rights complaint seeking $250,000 from several Indiana and Illinois police officers on grounds that they violated his rights by arresting him, searching his truck and this house on Keene Lane in Terre Haute where he'd stayed, all without cause. Tonight, Eyler's attorney tells us he's filing a new motion in the case, asking the police be made to turn over their notes and any lab tests they may have on him, that they be made to give back address books he says they took from him, and be made to stop contacting people listed in those books. Police tonight say they're looking for a man from Chicago, believed to be in Kentucky, who they say might help identify the killer.
Eyler cracked under the pressure. Furious, he filed a lawsuit against the police for psychological warfare, demanding $500,000. The lawsuit went nowhere, and instead he was arrested again, this time formally charged with the murder of Ralph Calise. But in early 1984, the case collapsed. On February 1st, Eyler was released on bond when a judge ruled that key evidence had been obtained illegally. Detectives watched in disbelief as their prime suspect walked free yet again. Just 3 months later, on May 7, 1984, the body of 22-year-old David Block was found near Lake Forest, Illinois. His wounds matched the pattern of previous victims. Eyler had killed again, almost immediately after being released. But his freedom was finally running out. On August 21, 1984, a janitor working in Eyler's Chicago apartment building noticed a dog pawing at several trash bags behind the property. When he opened one of the bags, he recoiled in horror. Inside were the remains of 15-year-old Danny Bridges. Police were called immediately. The contents of the bags, dismembered remains, bindings, tools, tied directly back to Eyler. This time, there was no loophole, no missing witness, no technicality. Eyler was arrested and charged with murder. His trial began on September 13, 1984. 2 years later, in July 1986, his former friend and rumored accomplice Dr. Little was called to testify, though he denied involvement. On September 30, 1986, Judge Urso sentenced Eyler to death by lethal injection. Eyler was sent to Pontiac Prison, where he awaited his appeal before the Illinois Supreme Court in 1988. But what came next shocked many. In 1990, growing weak from AIDS-related complications, Eyler attempted to negotiate. He offered to confess to more than 20 murders, detailing locations and victims, and even to testify against Robert Little, if the state would reduce his sentence to 60 years. The state refused. Little's office was raided that December, but when his lawyer failed to appear, he was released without charges. He never faced trial. On March 6, 1994, Larry Eyler died in prison at age 41 from complications related to AIDS. With his death, he avoided the death penalty he had been sentenced to. Shortly before passing, he gave his attorney the details of his full confession, linking himself to dozens of murders across the Midwest. His final chapter closed with the same mixture of brutality, mystery, and unanswered questions that defined his life. To this day, not all of Eyler's victims have been identified. Not all of his claims were verified, and the full scope of the highway killer's crimes may never be completely understood.